Well, good morning. I'm going to start today with a recap of an old presentation I gave on record loss and doing your family history in spite of all of the difficulties that arise when records have been lost in a county for whatever reason. Could be a fire, could be a flood, could be um, negligence, could be storing records in a place where their integrity can't be preserved, where they become damaged by vermin or moisture. And I want to start with a story. And it's a story that relates to the place where I grew up. Because there are so many places in our country, and many courthouses where records have been lost. Sometimes they can be explained, and sometimes people are not that interested in trying to explain why the records aren't there. But in this case, we know exactly what happened. The events of the night of Thursday, September the 5th, 1889, would remain fixed in the memories of many inhabitants of the small town of Carthage in North Carolina for years to come, because Carthage is a little town, a village really, set on a hill in north central Moore County. It was formerly called Cross Hill, and it was located on the main road leading from Fayetteville to Salem. But it was otherwise quite a backwater little place with very little of consequence happening. It certainly struck a poor comparison to the ancient North African city, the center of an empire, for which it was named. The town founders must have had aspirations for great things when they christened it, just like the neighboring county of Montgomery did when it named its courthouse town in the 1840s for the fabled high-walled Troy. But the place could never really seem to get its momentum going. It was always just a quiet little place. But Carthage was the county seat, and it was the site where court sessions sat quarterly, and where public records going back to 1784 were kept. I still remember the old hanging tree that used to be pointed out to me when I was a child on the courthouse grounds. Many of the main shops in the town were laid out around that courthouse square and the circle, the traffic circle that went around it. There was a dime store, a pharmacy, a soda shop, lawyers' offices, the shoe store, the town's only grocery, its only furniture store. Those were all there in that little courthouse square. But around 1887, the courthouse was entirely renovated at a cost of nearly $15,000, of which about a third was still owing from the public coffers 2 years later. And it was on the night of September the 5th, 1889, that Matthew Cagle, a farmer from the northern part of Moore County, had set up camp on the courthouse green. He probably had business to conduct in court the following day, and he could not find or afford lodging. Such was a common practice at the time. About 2 a.m., he noted a reflection of candlelight through the window of the registrar's office, but he thought little of it, believing that some clerk was probably finishing his work late into the night. So he went back to sleep. Around 4 a.m., he was awakened by his son. They could smell smoke and saw flames through the same window where they had noted the candle earlier. Mr. Cagle rushed into the building, which it must have been the trusting custom to leave unlocked at the time, and went up to the door of the office. It was partly ajar, and smoke was billowing out. Glancing in, he could see a pile of books and papers in the middle of the floor upon which the fire had been kindled, probably with a good dousing of lamp oil. But the blaze was still in its early stages, so he and his son rushed to the town well, located only a short distance away. He later said that he believed that the two of them could have put out the flames in short order if only they could have gotten a few buckets out up the stairs. But they found that the rope on the windlass was cut, and the buckets were thrown down into the well, so they couldn't even get at the water. Now, as the fire spread and intensified, the registrar's office soon became engulfed. A cry of "Fire! Fire!" lifted into the night, and soon bells around the town started ringing. Men, women, and children, bleary-eyed from sleep, were gathering on the square and feeling helpless as the fire increased its fury. There was no fire department in those days, which was pretty common around the entire countryside. There were very few fire departments at that stage. But eventually the observers gathered their wits, and they thought about what they might salvage. So several men rushed into the clerk's office to shift every volume they could lay their hands on. To speed up the work, they simply pitched everything out the windows. They just kept throwing the record books out one at a time until the flames reached the door. Then they beat a hasty retreat because they had no other options. The building was reduced to its foundations in very short order. The structural damage was devastating, but even more devastating was the loss of the county's cache of records, over 100 years worth of them, which had been preserved largely inviolate until that day. The devastation is described in the following sentences in the newspaper article from that terrible night. The loss from the clerk's office was about 500 judgment rolls, all the probate papers, most of the old court minutes and dockets, all guardian books and bonds, all administrator bonds, all Supreme Court reports and acts of the legislature. All other books and papers are saved. Every book and paper in the registrar's office, including the 1889 tax books, was lost. So was everything in the county superintendent's office. The town felt bereft after the conflagration. The courthouse was clearly its chief claim to importance. Those who had legal business in Carthage and anyone with title to property in the county suddenly found their interests compromised by this event. After all, it seemed it was done intentionally, probably by somebody who feared that documentation preserved by the court would be used against them. Now, we as genealogists, working nearly 130 years later, we also have cause to rue that loss. What the reporter failed to note was the destruction of some specific records that are so critical to what we do. Most importantly, all of the marriage bonds and licenses and all of the deed books that were in the registrar's office, all the apprentice and bastardy bonds, all the loose court records. For the period prior to 1889, what we have left in Moore County are some spotty court minutes and the will books, which thanks to those heroic men did survive. That's pretty much it, aside from a minor docket here or there. And sadly, this situation is not particularly uncommon. A large number of North Carolina counties have been affected by record devastation. Some of the most notorious examples are Moore and Montgomery, Anson, Bladen, Buncombe, Burke, Hertford, Washington, Lenoir, Greene, and Pitt counties. And I really don't have to tell you. You probably have experienced a lot of this in your own work. You can see a map that shows all the counties that have major record loss in the state of North Carolina outlined in black. There are many others that experienced more minor losses, perhaps only one series of records for a particular time period, or just a few record groups are gone, while most of the others remain. In the South, we like to blame all of our county courthouse fires on the, quote, damned Yankees, right? It's true that areas that saw a lot of fighting or the passage of troops were often hit hard. Virginia is a notorious local records wasteland because counties were asked to send their materials centrally to Richmond early in the war to avoid random destruction. And later in the war, when Richmond fell, many of those records were lost, but it was due to the ammunition depots blowing up, Confederate arms, not so much the depredations of the enemy. And it wasn't all Yankees, of course. For example, one letter that I found from a Confederate soldier in my family was written on the back and in the margins of a paper or a page torn from a Martin County courthouse book while he was stationed to hold off the Yankees at Newbern from the courthouse town of Trenton. Paper, after all, was hard to come by, for Confederate soldiers particularly, but more commonly this causes vary a lot. Anything from fire to flood to storm damage to the exigencies of war to clerks just deciding that they didn't have room for certain older records and pitching them out before there were any readily available preservation techniques or any repositories to send those records to that they didn't need for daily courthouse business anymore. Some losses arise from county officials keeping official documents among their own private papers, which may survive or not, and just not turning them back in, or from deterioration due to poor storage conditions or custodial negligence. Thievery accounts for some other spotty record series. It's a rare county which preserves almost all of its records intact. And some states, like Virginia and Alabama, and here you can see Alabama, for example, have experienced much worse record loss than North Carolina. It pays to research any county that you are working in and to note any gaps in the records before you start your research so that you'll know what to expect and what not to expect and how to compensate for the records you just can't get access to. Good resources for finding out include the state archives or library websites, county histories, the Family Search Wiki, which has a page for each county and its records, and printed guides to local records. In North Carolina, the State Archives has presented us with a list of the records that they hold, and at the top of each county list, they give any known record losses for that county, and if they know a reason, they give that reason as well. So, what should you do when you discover that your research has entered a county where local records are missing for a long period of time? I don't want to hold out false hope here. There are certainly situations in which the devastation is so total and it covers such a long period of time that it really leaves you with little to go on. And that's particularly problematic when the ancestors you have in that place were people with little property or standing in the community, whether they were illiterate or seldom got into scrapes with the law, either civil or criminal. But even those circumstances shouldn't prevent you from giving it a try. Let's look at each of the records we typically use when researching our ancestors and think about what we could do to replace the missing records. The general strategy is to look both for what survived the record destruction locally and for what was preserved at other levels of government, higher up the food chain, so to speak. Now, there's nothing to prevent us from using census records, pension applications, and other materials that were kept on the federal level. The census is key, and it's important to exploit all of its implications, particularly when households are listed in the order in which they were visited. Proximity means that families of the same name are likely to be related, especially when only a few households away from each other. And don't neglect those pre-1850 census records. They may be short on names. You just get the heads of household, right? And little ticks for different gender and age categories. But if you can do a little math and work by process of elimination, they can be a gold mine. Particularly when dealing with southern counties, we might think to look in slightly less prominent places, such as enlistment records, land grants for western federal land states, for example, Southern Claims Commission records, or Freedmen's Bureau records, direct federal tax records, even the records of the federal circuit courts, which sat in North Carolina. People often forget about those, but they were active from the very beginning of our country under the Federal Judiciary Act. Cases involving interstate disputes or violation of federal law, treason, prize cases at sea, piracy, intestate matters, trafficking in stolen goods, interference with the mails would have been within that court's purview. Disputes between residents of different states over inheritance are also figured there. For example, I found a case in a federal circuit court for North Carolina regarding some inhabitants of Montgomery County, North Carolina, which is a big burned county in central North Carolina, over slaves that they brought from Virginia to the state in the late 1700s. Two brothers owned these enslaved people in common, and one had no children, and so all their heirs are mentioned. People are deposed and testimony recorded from the county they came from in Virginia. Their Revolutionary War service is described, and neighbors in Montgomery County are also deposed, and their testimony is recorded. Their ages are given oftentimes in these depositions to give credibility to what they're saying. They lived long enough to know what they're talking about. Some of their ancestors in Virginia are identified. The slave families are described in detail with ages, relationships. I didn't know what I would find until I started looking, and in this family's case, that was a real gold mine. And it's interesting because it actually related to something we were researching locally, the Mendenhall family plantation. One of the Mendenhall men who was heavily engaged in trying to purchase enslaved people and then teaching them skills and then giving their eventual freedom in the North, he married one of the nieces of these men who died in the county of Montgomery and whose enslaved people were part of that effort. It was pure luck that it had something to do with something we were interested in. And by the way, the federal court materials are a treasure trove that anyone willing to delve into them will find to be the case. Other cases I've found involve a dispute over the property of a man from Cumberland County who fled to Nova Scotia as a Tory soon after the Revolutionary War, and he then later came back to claim what was his from his siblings under the terms of the peace treaty that ended the war. Another was over the identity of a merchant who fled his creditors in the North just after the Revolutionary War, and then he came to Onslow County, North Carolina, changed his name, remarried, and made a new fortune. But eventually, his first family in the North, whom he had abandoned, found out about him and about his death, and they came down to claim his estate against the second family because these second children, this group of children, was considered illegitimate. So this is wonderful detail, wonderful testimony, and never would have known about that incident without the federal court case. And remember that this is not just the members of your family that you should be looking for when you conduct the initial research. Pull records on any case you think relates to your burned county, particularly the area in the county where your ancestor lived, and read the documents. Your ancestor could figure as a neighbor or a witness, appear tangentially in the testimony, or could even be related to the disputants, and you would not know it because there are no local records to show that. In this kind of research, you cannot narrow your focus too much, or you'll certainly miss something. Now, what do you do, for example, if you don't have a will or estate record, and because the county records have burned, where could you look? In the colonial period, many estates were handled on the state level or the colony level, not on the local level, and would be filed with the Secretary of State's office or some equivalent officer. Remember that some estates involve litigation that arise to a higher level than just the local court. Check the district courts or the state level courts or state Supreme Court cases, which may involve an ancestor's probate settlement. Check courts in neighboring jurisdictions for estate-related cases that may have been transferred out of the original county because of local prejudice. If any tax records have been copied and forwarded to the state level authorities, like the treasurer or comptroller, Those records may show who owned the property after an ancestor died. Look at local newspaper records, which is a category of private records, for legal notices related to the estates, like notification to absent heirs, notices to creditors, and notices of estate sales, including sale of slaves. These are frequently omitted from published abstracts of newspaper contents, but they could be searched within digitized newspaper databases, and since they often ran across multiple issues of the newspaper, your chances of finding them are greater. So also, we have the problem sometimes of replacing vital records. Here's an example, by the way, of that kind of notice that you might get in an estate record for the in the newspaper. This is a petition to reprofound a will, and you get a sense of who the heirs were listed in that will, even though it's Bladen County where no records survive. Now, in the case of absence of vital records, no birth, marriage, or death due to courthouse loss, well, survey the local or regional newspaper for some information about these events. Although earlier newspapers privileged wealthy people, noteworthy people, sensational events, that's not always the case. Even respected members of the African American community or anyone who lived to an advanced age might be memorialized in a death notice, for example. Someone who died in a sensational manner, even though they might be a poor person, would appear in those pages. I've even found marriages for some very obscure people in my Johnson family recorded in the Greensboro Patriot. They were not reputable people. They didn't own any land. I don't know why they're included, but they are. Apart from the newspaper, check records of local houses of worship. They may still be kept by the church, or they might have been turned over to an archive within the church structure. Whatever that denomination is, find out where the archive is and find out what kinds of records they retain. If private records of local ministers survive, they might have registers they kept personally, which they never turned over to an ecclesiastical archive. The Friends, the Episcopalians, the Lutherans, Reformed ministers, the Catholics, all these denominations keep excellent records in general. If you can find a primitive Baptist in your line, you may get fewer dates, but you'll get instead a lot of dirty details on what your ancestors were up to, because of all the disciplinary sessions that church held, and they kept very copious minutes of who got punished for what. That's also true for Friends, because they had a lot of rules that had to be followed, and if you didn't, they were very specific about why you were getting reprimanded or cast out, what you had to do to get back in. Denominational newspapers are also a frequently overlooked source for vital records of ministers, deacons, missionaries, elders, and parishioners. And then, what about the family Bible? Have you traced down your cousins, even those you've never met before, from an ancestral family and tried to make contact? It's easier now than ever, with all these social media sites and city directories, people finder sites, white pages, people finder, and Tellius, sites like that. Sometimes you have to pay, but it can be worthwhile to pay so you can make contact with living cousins. You'd be surprised how some people will respond when you reach out to them and how much they know and can share with you. Technology has made it easier than ever to image materials that you would like to share with other people without risking loaning them to somebody and maybe never seeing them again. With somebody you don't know, that's particularly dangerous. What about tombstone surveys? Has one been conducted? If not, and don't forget the early ones conducted by the WPA in the 1930s, for example, some of those stones are no longer extant, have not been read recently, and cannot be photographed and put on Find a Grave today. If you've not looked at these sources, you might want to search out your ancestor's likely grave on site at the church. It still pays to go out there and look. People have missed things. You might find something other people that surveyed the cemetery have not. This is particularly true if you're African American, because the cemeteries were frequently skipped during surveys conducted by genealogical and lineage societies in years past for African Americans. And if the cemetery was on private land, it may have been missed entirely. Just keep in mind that few rural people in the Southeast had a carved gravestone before the middle of the 19th century. A lot of people don't realize that. They go looking for graves that are very unlikely to be found in any intelligible form that we can deduce that person is buried there. And here's one of those unusual substitutes you might find for a missing vital record. How many of us have thought to look at coroner's inquests in the county in which we're studying? Coroner's inquests oftentimes replace missing death records, and in this particular situation, this coroner's inquest in Marlborough County, South Carolina, shows the death of a grandmother that occurred in the 1870s as she was trying to put out a fire near her home in a brush fire. And it wasn't so much the flames that got her as her own illness. She had an asthmatic condition and a heart condition that led to her being choked by the flames and dying. And a lot of neighbors came to help when the children raised the cry. The husband was not at home, and they all gave testimony about the circumstances of her death. Remember that after a massive destruction of records, a lot of people were nervous about their chain of title. It wouldn't be. There's frequently a time period, though, in which everybody's encouraged to bring in their old deeds and have them re-recorded without charge. So many people would respond to that inducement. For example, we have 3 books full of abstracts of old Bladen County deeds that were brought in for re-recording after the last courthouse fire in 1893. In other cases, the charred remains of deed books were recopied as best they could be into the first new deed book after the cataclysm. Deed Book 14 in Montgomery County, for example, includes many such examples of salvaged deeds. And believe me, if your family appears in one of them, you're going to be real grateful that it's there. The records of the granting authority in the state will often survive when local deed books do not. The original grants, and it might be the state, Secretary of State's office is granting those land grants if it's a state land set up, or if it's a federal land setup, it would be the General Land Office in the Bureau of Land Management that would be preserving those records, and they're all digitized, they're all online. You can look at the warrants and surveys. In those records, you will see the names of the neighbors when it was granted, the landmarks, the streams. Importantly, you might find chain bearers on some of those grants who are young people in the neighborhood who were assisting young men in the laying out of the land, and they're sometimes relatives of the grantee. Vacant land continued to be an issue into the mid-1800s in most places. There was also litigation sometimes over land grants, which we call caveats. They might be heard at the sovereign level instead of the local level, and those court cases could be really interesting. If it's only a matter of a few missing deed books and court records do survive, you might be able to find in the minutes of the court where the court ordered the deeds to be recorded. That will at least give you a grantee and grantor and recording witness when the original deed is missing. There are situations where the indexes, grantor and grantee, are to the surviving deed books, or rather to the deed books. They survive, the indexes do, but the books themselves do not. That's the case out in the eastern part of North Carolina, Lenoir County and Greene County, that area. We've got some indexes in the Dobbs when we don't have the actual deed books themselves. Again, you get grantor, grantee, perhaps acreage, and some indication of the date when the deed was recorded. It's a help, though not everything you might wish for. From the document I'm showing you here, You can see how I pieced together the family of William Parker of Montgomery County, North Carolina, my ancestor. 4 men, William Parker Sr. and his sons Garrett, William Jr., and John, all got land grants in the 1790s in the same area of the county. And they did one another the service of bearing the chain on the surveys, as you can see in these abstracts. There were no other Parkers near them, mercifully, so that combined with census records, which showed their relative ages, clearly connected them as father and sons. As it turned out, another early Montgomery County land grantee, Humphrey Garrett, turned out to be the nephew of William Parker Sr.'s wife, hence the name of William's son, Garrett Parker. One of the important things to remember about working in a burned county is that eventually, if you persist, you may be able to move your ancestors out of it to a prior residence where their documents are better. So what if we want to replace court records that we can no longer find in the local courthouse? Well, again, simply looking up the chain to the higher courts who heard appeals from lower courts is a key strategy. A tremendous amount of information about people in the county will be found if you simply make an effort to survey all the relevant appealed cases from the period you're interested in. Look also at courts in neighboring counties to which cases were often transferred because of perceived local prejudice. Here's an example of a case involving civil damages that a man sought in Montgomery County against a boarder who had impregnated his daughter in the 1830s or 40s. The case was so hot to handle in Montgomery County, and there was so much prejudice against the girl, that they moved the case to Cabarrus County, and then it was appealed to the state Supreme Court, which is why I found it. But in general, you'll discover that surveying materials in adjacent counties may work to your benefit. People's legal interests and family ties often cross county lines, as did their contacts. They get pulled into disputes across those lines, particularly if they live near the borders. Now, a good example of this situation is my Sykes family of Orange County, North Carolina. Tradition in our family stated that the Sykes and the Cates families came down from Prince George County, Virginia in the mid-1700s to North Carolina, to what is now Orange County. Bernard Cate was allegedly the son of Rebecca Sykes Cate, who was the daughter of John Sykes and a descendant of a very prominent Yorkshire family. The immigrant was named Bernard Sykes, and he held some pretty high offices in early colonial Virginia. Hence the name Bernard Cate, apparently, named for his grandfather Bernard Sykes. The Sykes family in England is very well documented and produced ministers, merchants, diplomats, justices of the peace. Bernard Cate is also said to have married a Sykes cousin, Jane or Jenny Sykes. A number of other Cates men married Jane or Jenny's siblings. And this can be documented using old letters that have survived in the Cate family in Tennessee, that there were these sisters named Sykes who married into the Cates lineages. I can document that Jane Sykes Cate's mother was named Mary Sykes, and that she died about 1812. And Jane had some brothers named Alan Sykes and John Sykes who came with her to North Carolina. The father was never here. The first land acquired in North Carolina in the mid-1770s was taken out in the mother's name. The father must have died in Virginia, but who was he? Well, Prince George has only 2 or 3 record books that survived from the 18th century, and its predecessor county, Charles City County, is likewise in that same situation. And it was there are a few books there for the period just prior to the formation of Prince George. Now, there's a lot of information in those books that we do have about the Sykes and the Wyatts, said to be our ancestral families for the Cates line. There's enough there to document everything, but the transitional generation who moved to North Carolina. John Sykes, who married Frances Wyatt, died in 1732. Some of his children are documented, some are not. How will we determine if or whether Mary and her Sykes children fit into this family? Well, there are some clues. Albemarle Anglican Parish Register, which covers part of Prince George, Sussex, and Southampton counties for this period, shows a family that is almost certainly tied to John Sykes and Frances Wyatt. John Wilkinson and his wife Anne named children John Sykes Wilkinson and Wyatt Wilkinson. They were born in 1753 and 1755. Now, court records in nearby Surrey County prove that Thomas Cate was a co-defendant about this very time when these children were being born with John Wilkinson in a cause of debt brought by the same plaintiff. This probably means that they entered into an obligation together for which they were both liable. This was about the time that Thomas Cate, who was married to Rebecca Sykes, remember, apparently moved to North Carolina. But a bit later, I discovered that John Wilkinson owned land in Sussex County, adjacent to land owned by one Thomas Sykes. Now, this Thomas Sykes was resident at that time and continued to be resident in Prince George County, but he had land in Sussex. The Sykes land in Sussex was eventually sold in the 1770s by someone named Bernard Sykes, who also lived in Prince George. And over the years, the Wilkinsons and the Sykes were repeatedly involved in the same legal cases in Sussex County until a 1770s case appeared in which John Wilkinson brought against the new owner a case against that owner named Bernard Sykes. Now, given the fact that Cate's ancestors named children John Sykes Cates and Thomas Sykes Cates, and you can see them in this chart near the bottom, there's more than one of them. There are at least two Thomas Sykes Cates. There's a Wyatt Cates, a John Sykes Cates, and another John Sykes Cates in different lineages. It suddenly became quite clear to me that Thomas Sykes, whom no one I'd ever talked to about this matter had ever taken notice of before, because he was not mentioned in surviving Prince George County records, even though he lived there, was probably the husband of Mary Sykes, who moved to Orange County with her children. One of her daughters married her cousin Bernard Cate. Now, there is no deed which transferred the Sussex land from Thomas Sykes to Bernard Sykes. So how did Bernard end up with that land in the early 1770s when he was sued by the Wilkinsons? Well, probably because Thomas Sykes died without a will. With a will, rather, that left it to Bernard, which hasn't survived, or perhaps because Thomas died intestate and Bernard was the eldest son. As the heir, he remained in Virginia, and the widow and her younger children picked up and moved to North Carolina at precisely this time. At the same time, I think I can say with some confidence that Thomas Sykes was probably the brother-in-law of John Wilkinson and a son of John Sykes and Frances Wyatt, because he owned land next to John Wilkinson in Sussex County, even though he lived some distance away in Prince George, and because their families were intertwined in court cases in Sussex over many years. The key to finding the link, however, was looking beyond a record-deprived county into a neighboring one that maintained a large set of 18th century records. In this instance, the family had lingering interest and family ties across county lines, and this is not necessarily unusual. Don't forget, some other state-level records are also pertinent to court matters, in particular governor's papers, which contain numerous petitions to the governor for clemency or extradition in capital cases, when local copies of tax lists are missing. Look in the state treasurer's papers. Also, what about petitions to the legislature or the governor from counties which contain the names of many inhabitants that might have appeared in the tax list if they had survived, or might fill in gaps in census records, which only named heads of households. When local military records are missing, look at records found in the office of the state adjutant general who was over the state militia. And by analogy, many other records can be supplemented in a similar way by looking up the chain to the state level. But last and certainly not least, when the public records fail you in the local level, you have to consider what might have survived in private hands. Now, we've talked a little bit about newspapers and church records. Those are certainly private records. There are sometimes business ledgers. Those can be exceedingly interesting if you pay attention. Not only might you find out who was doing business with a local merchant and what they bought, but who paid off their accounts, who particularly they were purchasing products or services for. Sometimes merchants will tally up their losses when they no longer can collect monies owed to them. Some ledgers show that individuals skipped out on their debts and where they are rumored to have gone. Now, my Sykes family of early King and Queen County, Virginia, is largely documented through the ledgers of a local mercantile firm, along with land patents. King and Queen County just offers a very little in the way of local records. But because of that merchant's ledger in different generations, I have a skeletal idea of the family's development over time and the names that they used in each generation from those two sources alone. Now, even more important and more revealing are personal papers. These reflect the daily lives of ancestors, their attitudes and personalities, and they're like nothing else that we have at our disposal for really getting at the individual. They might consist of scrapbooks, photographs, personal letters, journals, school exercise books, clippings, legal and business papers, accounts, memorabilia, and family records. Even genealogical investigations that took place 100 or more years ago may be revealed in these documents. And again, don't just search for your family name. Search for records that pertain to anyone and everything in the community where your ancestor lived. Use Archive Grid, the National Union Catalog of Manuscript Collections, NUCMUC, or the catalogs of public and private universities in the state concerned. And you can also use the PERSI, the Periodical Source Index, to find private materials that may have been published in local genealogical journals in the past. Lots of old letters and journals, account books, and so forth have been published in these local family history publications that are very difficult to, really know much about from a distance, from another state, for example. I often think about all of our kin here in North Carolina who went out to the West, and doubtless they received letters from people back east, some of our own ancestors, and they've been published over the years, and we just don't even know it because we never subscribed to journals out in Iowa or Indiana or Ohio. You might also want to use the county or town as a search term rather than a specific surname when you're looking in these indexes. Rather than a specific surname, because in a burned county, anything that it survives could be helpful, even from another family, and sometimes you don't even know who your family is altogether because you don't have the records. Check out denominational archives for church records from your area. Other things you will find just on site in a local museum or library. They may not even be in any sense indexed or available on the web to even know that they exist, much less to get access to the original record. The genealogical research trip to an ancestral locality is passé these days, but it's still quite useful, and it can really pay off sometimes. It's too bad so many people miss out because they don't want to travel. They just have gotten so addicted to the convenience of sitting here at home at the computer. And now that this pandemic is over, we're getting close to it being over, we don't really have the excuse of staying home anymore. Another method, of course, is to track down distant cousins and ask them what they still might have in their own personal possession. not in an archive, just in their own possession that they might be willing to share. We've already alluded to that. But I've gotten some very good results from that process over the years. And before I move on to the genetic aspect, just to give you an example about private records, when I first started researching my DeBerry family in Montgomery County, North Carolina, I really wanted to know who Sarah, the wife of Henry DeBerry, was prior to marriage. Henry was a pretty important guy. He was the first sheriff of the county. He was a gunsmith, a veteran of the Revolutionary War, apparently serving with Francis Marion, and he was a wealthy guy, but there was no indication as to whom he had married. The county's records were destroyed for the period. How would I find out more about Sarah? Well, at the State Archives, there was a set of papers called the Woolley, Preston, and DeBerry Papers. And I looked at them on microfilm and found an estate record for someone named Nehemiah Dumas. They were kept in these DeBerry family papers. They showed that Dumas was a bachelor and his heirs were his siblings. And Sarah was one of those siblings, because the receipts of her share of her children for their share of the estate were among those records in this private collection. So now I know that Sarah was a daughter of David Dumas and his wife Sarah Mormon. And given all my ATDNA matches with Mormon descendants from Virginia, I know that the papers didn't lead me astray. In another case, looking for a McCrae family that's also in that Mount Gilead area of Montgomery County, I ran into a set of Scarborough family papers at Duke University. And I didn't know the Scarborough papers had anything to do with my local families, but just because it was from Montgomery County, I decided to one day to sit down and look and see what was in there. Well, Mr. Scarborough, Henry Scarborough, collected everything from the community he could get his hands on, apparently. And among his papers were several old letters of the 1830s and 40s sent to two McCrae sisters I had been studying, and they revealed connections within that family that I hadn't any other way of knowing about. Don't forget, even if you study East Coast families, a lot of the pertinent collections will be out west, because so many of our cousins moved in that direction. Think of all the letters our ancestors sent, as I said before, to their western cousins and where they might be hiding today. Now, I've mentioned DNA frequently in tonight's program because in a supplementary sense, it can really help confirm a lot of the hunches that we get from all of the paper-based sources when a county's records are missing. And we don't get as complete indication in these fragmentary records as we would like. So DNA can help to undergird what we're getting from those remnants. It's a vital resource, but it can be of very little help with all the context that a thorough search of paper records can provide. Test yourself, test as many older people in your family as you can, principally autosomal DNA for everyone and Y DNA associated with direct male lineages and surnames that interest you. The results can provide you with the assurance that you're on the right track when you're working with fragments, or they can show you that you've taken a wrong turn, which is equally important. And we've got a little DNA-related talk on this channel that you can use to learn a little bit more about the autosomal side of DNA research. But it's much better to know, if you're on the wrong track, that you're wasting your time and you need to think of another option. So in conclusion, the key to research in a burned county is resourcefulness and imagination. If you spend some time thinking about what might have survived and where it might be found, if you put extra hours to locate and search through that material and then gather and collate everything that might be helpful, you'll come up with some theories at least about relationships that you can then subject to scientific testing through genetic evidence, perhaps, if it's something within the last, say, 250 to 300 years. Such an effort requires you to think outside of the box, to press the boundaries of your inquiry beyond the borders of your own family, looking for and researching names in the community as a whole, as we've talked about. You never know what you might find or who you might help, certainly not just yourself. I really think the best approach to a county that has experienced record loss would be collaborative in nature. Ideally, people would want to set up study groups online, like on the Facebook pages that different counties have set up, where they do individual research, but then abstract or transcribe and share anything they find in their broad-based searches. Even a website or a wiki or something devoted to a county would be tremendously helpful for some of these burned record counties, because you're going to find stuff that might help somebody else. It may not help you particularly, but it will definitely help somebody else, and there needs to be some place where you can share it, because in that scenario everyone could profit and no research would be done in vain simply because a particular name didn't appear. So here's some tips for you as you consider that seemingly insurmountable obstacle of a county with lost records. See if you can try some of these options for your research and where it will lead you. And I bid you good research and good luck.